Chapter 3: The Neuroscience of Flow. Leslie Sherlin studies the brains of people making decisions. Very good decisions. He's one of the world's leading experts in the neuroelectricity of high performance, explicitly focusing on qualitative electroencephalography, EEG. Whenever you encounter stimuli, or have a thought, explained Sherlin in The Rise of Superman, the brain has an electrical response. EEG measures those responses down to the 1/1000th of a second range, which allows us to track how the brain changes across time. When someone is making a decision, and this can be an athlete solving a problem or an artist solving an aesthetic one, we can see everything that leads up to a decision, the decision itself, and everything that happens as a result. As those electric responses occur in bursts, they create waves. Brain waves is what an EEG actually measures. There are 5 major brainwave types measured by an EEG, each correlating to a different state of consciousness. Delta, the slowest brainwave, meaning the one with the longest pauses between bursts of electricity, is found between 1 Hz and 3.9 Hz. When someone is in a deep, dreamless sleep, they're in delta. Next up, between 4 Hz and 7.9 Hz, is theta, which correlates to REM sleep, meditation, insight, and, as often as necessary for insight, the processing of novel incoming stimuli. Between 8 Hz and 13.9 Hz hovers alpha, the brain's basic resting state. You're relaxed, calm, and vivid in alpha, but not really thinking. Beta sits between 14 Hz and 30 Hz, and implies learning and concentration at the low end, fear and stress at the high end. Above 30 Hz, there's a fast-moving wave known as gamma, which only shows up during binding, when different parts of the brain combine disparate thoughts into a single idea. The EEG is very good at detecting networks. The technology can see which parts of the brain are talking to one another at any given time. Thus, when decisions are being made, EEG can help determine the structure of his network detection ability that provides us with our first neurological insight into a flow experience. Csikszentmihalyi used EEG to examine the brains of chess masters mid-game. He found a significant decrease in activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain housing most of our higher cognitive functions, such as problem-solving, reasoning, and decision-making. This may seem surprising. Chess is a game of logic, planning, and strategy, 3 things that appear to require higher cognitive functions. But this isn't the only way the brain can make decisions. Neuroanatomy of flow. Human beings have evolved 2 different systems for processing information. The first, the explicit system, is rule-based, expressed verbally, and ties to conscious awareness. When the prefrontal cortex is fired up, the explicit system is usually turned on. But when the cold calculus of logic is swapped out for the gut sense of intuition, this is the implicit system at work. This implicit system relies on skill and experience, and is not consciously accessible, and cannot be described verbally, i.e., try to explain a hunch. These 2 systems are often described as conscious versus unconscious, or left brain versus right brain. There are 2 advantages to the brain using the implicit system. The first is speed. When the brain finds a task it needs to solve, writes Baylor neuroscientist David Eagleman in Incognito, it rewires its own circuitry until it can accomplish this task with maximum efficiency. The task becomes burned into the machinery. Automation permits fast decision-making. Only when the slow system of consciousness is pushed to the back of the queue can rapid programs do their work. Should I wing forehand or backhand at the approaching tennis ball? With a 90-mile-per-hour projectile on its way, one does not want to cognitively slog through the different options. Efficiency is the second advantage. Our brain is 2% of our body weight, yet consumes 20% of our energy. Eagleman continues. As a result, it's always looking for ways to converse. Using the explicit system to think through decisions burns a lot of calories, but switching to the implicit minimizes the energy required to solve problems, so therefore, it's very efficient. This is also why Csikszentmihalyi found little activity in the prefrontal cortex of chess masters. After years of playing, they'd internalize board patterns and move sequences, and didn't have to rely on their conscious mind to work through every option. Instead, their explicit system went offline, and the implicit system turned on. Since low alpha, high theta is the dominant brainwave produced by the implicit system, this frequency has long been considered the signature of high performance. In the zone, says Sherlin, you still see the same fluidity in the transitions between states, but you also see even more control. Instead of producing all these other brainwaves, really great athletes can transition smoothly into the zone, creating that high theta, low alpha wave, and then hold themselves there, sort of in suspended animation, shutting out the conscious mind and letting the implicit system do its stuff. To illustrate this further, consider Hamilton's experience on the Millennium Wave. Before he grabbed the tow rope, he assessed the situation, trying to predict the future. Feeling fear, the classic beta. But once he was pulled toward the wave, when he started to shut out outside stimuli and focus on the task at hand, that's a burst of alpha, and Hamilton's transition into flow. The angel-devil argument was really about alpha versus beta. The angel was alpha. It was the implicit system saying, let's go for it. We know what to do. The devil was beta. It was the explicit system saying, hold up a second, let's just gather more data. But the angel won. Hamilton suppressed that beta wave and got himself to alpha theta, the signature of the flow state, and held himself there. Of course, the Millennium Wave didn't end when Hamilton found the zone. Moments later, he was getting sucked up by that wave's face. So while the implicit system is capable of high-speed pattern recognition, which helped him realize what was happening a little sooner, it took more than just that to survive. He still had to have a creative insight no one had ever had before, and pull off a tricky move that no one had ever attempted before. It was an impossible within an impossible already, which makes one wonder how it could have happened. Turns out, over the past decade, we've learned a great deal about how flow makes such things possible, and more fitting within the premises of this book, how flow makes the impossible possible for us. Not surprisingly, our creativity lies deeply rooted in the right side of the brain, the side dominated by the implicit system. The reason has to do with the structure of neural networks. When the explicit system, left side of the brain, handles a problem, the neurons involved are very close to one another. This proximity leads to linear connections, logical deductions, and all the other keystones of standard reasoning. When the implicit system is at work, its reaches are much broader, far-flung corners of the brain that are in communication to one another. This is known to experts as lateral thinking, which means solving problems by a creative approach, typically through viewing the issue in a new and unusual light. It also means that novel stimuli can combine with random thoughts and vague memories that result in something entirely new. And this means creative problem solving. Creativity and flow. Creativity has a brainwave signature as well, alpha waves pulsing out of the brain's right hemisphere. This is considered the readiness state for sudden insight, meaning not the revelation itself, rather its precursor conditions. That Hamilton never panicked may also play a role. It now seems that without a calm, relaxed frame of mind, the brain is incapable of switching from beta-dominant localized networks to alpha-driven widespread webs. But this isn't where the process ends. When Hamilton pulled off the move on the Chopu wave, that moment of sudden insight comes with a different brainwave signature. Exactly 30 milliseconds before that breakthrough intuition arrives, EEG shows a burst of gamma waves. These ultra-fast brainwaves appear when many widely distributed cells, i.e., novel stimuli, random thoughts, and vague memories, bind themselves together into a brand new network. It is the brainwave signature of the aha moment. The interesting thing about a gamma spike, explains Leslie Sherlin, is that it always happens inside of theta oscillations. The two waves are coupled. It makes sense. Theta processes novel incoming stimuli. Gamma happens when those stimuli snap together into new ideas. But it's hard to do any of this on command. This is where athletes in flow have a huge edge. Their brain is already in alpha theta. They're holding themselves in the only state that can produce that gamma spike. When you add all these elements together, it's easy to see why flow is such an effective decision-making strategy. Not only does it elevate our problem-solving abilities, but by holding themselves in low alpha, high theta needed to produce that gamma spike, people in the zone are already neurologically poised on the brink of a breakthrough. This means flow packs a double punch. It doesn't just increase our decision-making ability, it increases our creative problem-solving abilities as well. High stakes into flow. By now, you'll understand that the people most likely to tap into a high-intensity state are action sports athletes, while putting their life in danger. The experience of flow, a dilated sense of time, hyper-awareness of yourself and what you're doing, clarity of mind, is similar to the feeling of time dilation experienced at near-death experiences. This may not be accidental. In near-death situations, our brain goes into overdrive to increase our chances of making it through. Extreme sports fanatics tap into this state more easily than other people due to taking the shortcut by actually creating these life-and-death situations. It's either get into the zone or suffer the consequences. If you want to experience the high-intensity state flow without risking your life, you're out of luck. Just kidding. When people think about action and adventure sports athletes, the first thing, often the only thing they think about, is the physical risk involved. But the greatest athletes aren't interested in the greatest risks. I mean, they do take physical risks, but those physical risks are a stepping stone of a much deeper desire: creative self-expression. In action and adventure sports, creativity is always the point. When you're out skiing or skating with your friends, explains action sports writer Micah Abrams, if you see your friend do something mind-bending, there's a natural inclination to immediately want to try it, immediately want to add to it. Everyone builds off each other's creativity. In action and adventure sports, it's all about creativity. There are a great number of risks that can get you into flow, with taking a physical risk being only one of them. Every time we have a creative idea and share it with the world, we come up against some very primal risks: risk of failure, risk of social ridicule, risk of criticism, risk of rejection. Writing this book is a considerable risk. Risk of loss of resources, time, money, opportunity costs. Starting a company is considered one of the riskiest and most creative acts in business. There is significant risk involved in every step of the process. Once danger becomes its own reward, wrote Stephen Kotler in The Rise of Superman. Risk moves from a threat to be avoided to a challenge to be risen toward. An entirely new relationship with fear begins to develop. When the risk is a challenge, fear becomes a compass, literally pointing people in the direction they need to go, i.e., the direction that produces more flow. By now, you know that there's a risk involved to get you into a flow state, but place yourself in two risky situations, and no flow. Back to square one. Struggle, anxiety, arousal, restlessness. All this results from excess production of stress hormones, such as secretions, adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol, and other stress-related hormones. This, accompanied by the potentially destructive flight or flight response, will drag you down into mediocre performance and perhaps even damage your health. The fight or flight response, aka a cocktail of adrenaline, cortisol, and norepinephrine, is an extreme stress response. The brain switches to reactive survival autopilot, and options are limited to 3: fight, flee, or freeze. Flow is the opposite of that. It's a creative problem-solving state. Options are wide open. Yet there are reasons for the confusion. The two states are linked. Risk heightens focus, and flow follows focus. This means that the fight or flight response primes your body, chemically and psychologically, for a flow state. Athletes report moving through one to get to the other. For example, when Hamilton pushes off of Chopu, he has seconds to flip the switch from the fight or flight response to the relaxation response. If he can follow his focus into flow, he lives to ride another day. But if panic swaps the circuitry, we'd still be picking up pieces of him out of Chopu's reef. Once I drop into the wave, recalls Hamilton, it becomes automatic, like driving a car. That's when I calm down, when my conscious mind snaps off and I dive into the zone. The relaxation response, according to experiments run by Harvard cardiologist Herbert Benson, is flow's real trigger. More on that in part 3. But how did Hamilton manage to get himself into flow while riding the mother of all waves? This all has to do with what scientists call situational awareness. Training in high-stress situations increases what psychologists call situational awareness. Defined as the ability to absorb information accurately, assess it calmly, and respond appropriately. Situational awareness is essentially the ability to keep cool when all hell breaks loose. When we look at Chopu and other big waves, we feel this overwhelming fear, dread, and awe, because that's what evolution designed us to feel. But that's not what Hamilton felt, or at least to say, he wasn't overwhelmed by the fear. It was just a couple percentage out of his comfort zone. You need to know that Hamilton grew up in Hawaii. His father, Bill Hamilton, considered the most stylish surfer of his era, had no problem taking his son to the beach. The beach was the legendary Bonsai Pipeline, one of the more vicious breaks in surfing. But the pipeline was Bill's playground. Thus, it became Laird's as well. People always ask me if I feel fear in the big waves, says Hamilton. Of course I'm afraid. If I went out in 50-foot surf and I'm not feeling fear, then I'm not properly assessing the situation. But it's different when you're raised in these conditions. When I was a kid, I was rescued every 4 or 5 days at the pipeline. The currents would catch me and drag me out, and the lifeguard would have to come to get me. Eventually, they got so pissed off, they told my father to lock me up while he surfed. Equally insidious is how flow prepares us to handle these risky challenges. In this state, our skills are peaking, our inner critic is shut down, and our ability to feel fear is significantly dampened. I felt I could not be hurt, wrote Brazilian soccer star Pelé in his autobiography My Life and the Beautiful Game. Perhaps it was merely confidence. But I have felt confident many times before without that strange feeling of invincibility. The feeling of invincibility. Exercising control in difficult situations is very satisfying. It leads to feeling powerful and a sense of being able to make a difference. This is where the enjoyment from the control aspect of flow comes from. Not from exerting control when nothing or very little is at stake, but doing so when the challenges are extending beyond the present reach. You can't imagine anything going wrong, wrote the iconic Manchester United and England star Gary Neville in his autobiography, Red. Like my opposite number was a very good player, probably one of the best 2 wingers in the world. At the start of the game, I could imagine myself missing him in tackles, whereas at the end of the game, there was no way that he was ever going to beat me. Even though he's probably a far better player, I couldn't even consider that at the end of the game. Another aspect of feeling invincible is a tremendous sense of calm. I just had a feeling of absolute calm. Neville continued. Like everything's going right for you. That whatever you're going to do, even your teammates, you knew that they were going to do it right. Sometimes in team sports, one or more teammates can create a momentum that helps to bring about a team flow. Because so many more factors need to be right, team flow in sports is more difficult to attain. Still, when it occurs, the team members all being in tune with one another, the performance can be a very special experience. Flow allows athletes to fully partake in their sports without holding back for fear or failure or embarrassment. Whether experienced by an individual athlete or a team, flow provides freedom from concerns that things may not work out. The feeling is really wild, wrote figure skater Michelle Kwan in Heart of the Champion. You feel like you completely abandon everything. You push harder than you ever push. You're not afraid that anything bad is going to happen. This lack of fear, lack of restraint, is really what the feeling of control and flow is all about. The sensation these athletes describe is another of flow's defining characteristics, and quite a paradox. The paradox is real control in places we should have none. The expression control is easily misunderstood. It can put many people off by its association with compulsive domination or nervous attention. Control and flow has none of these qualities. It is a state of security and relaxation, with a complete absence of worry. The paradox known in Zen Buddhism as control without controlling. The sense of control is ultimately a byproduct of autonomy, being free to do what you want, and competence, being good at what you do. It's about getting to choose your own challenges and having the necessary skills to surmount them. In addition, because flow is so enjoyable, we tend to seek out situations where we can expect it. This necessarily involves developing greater skills and taking on increasingly greater challenges. Furthermore, in increasing the intensity of the feeling, you are led to increasingly higher levels of athletic performance. Understanding flow, however, offers more than the development of athletic performance. Once the keys to flow are understood, the opportunity to develop one's whole life begins to emerge. At that point, it becomes possible to transform the entirety of life from a stressful and chaotic chase into something resembling an enjoyable dance. When everything goes away, as if it almost happens in slow motion and nothing else matters, then you're in flow. The audience fades away. Michelle Kwan continues. Except for the brief moment when they're clapping so loudly. Actually, that's even part of the experience. It never takes you out of focus. The merging of action and awareness has almost a mystical feeling. It's what Zen monks try to achieve or yogis aim to reach with their meditative practices. Basketball players become one with the ball. Cyclists see their bike as an extension of their bodies. Jazz musicians feel the music, the audience, the total environment. We're getting ahead to the experience of flow, and therefore part 2 of the book. But before we go into the characteristics of flow, there is still one component missing in our quest to map out the practical value of flow: the faster learning ability in flow. Certainly, what we learn from Hamilton's experience is that flow is the secret to ultimate human performance. Yet riding the Millennium Wave lasted less than 2 minutes. The quest in this book isn't about how flow helps these athletes do the impossible once. It's about long-term mastery, not short-term success. And a certain question most certainly answered in Stephen Kotler's Search for Mastery.